Now, the Debt Management Office, the DMO, has enlisted primary dealer market makers to raise funds for Nigeria's domestic debt plan. The DMO has raised a portion of the financing for both domestic debt and ways and means borrowing, which they plan to finish. So, at this segment, we have Kelvin Emmanuel, economist and CEO, Dairy Hill, and he will be helping us to dissect this further. Thank you so much, Kelvin, for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me. Good morning to you.
Now, looking at this latest development, are these fixed income instruments treasury bills, or what form of security are they?
So NTB, Nigerian treasury bills, basically like instruments that the Debt Management Office that is under the Ministry of Finance uses to mop up liquidity from the system. It's currently about 93.7 trillion. But there is also the fact that the government needs to raise money to finance the deficit in the budget. Deficit financing that was proposed for 2024 is around 48%, which is very high, which is up from 16.7% where we had it 10 years ago. The government plans to borrow like 6 trillion in 2024 from the domestic markets. And so far, it's raised about 75% of that at 4.5 trillion. My worry is the rate at which it's raising that money, because as inflation goes up and the Central Bank of Nigeria revises the monetary policy rate and prime lending rate goes up, and you can see that the CBN and the MPC has revised it by 600 basis points. As a matter of fact, later this afternoon, when they come up with their rate decision, I'm expecting that they will hike the MPR by an additional 150 basis points or 1.5% to 26.25%, because since they hiked in March, the inflation rate has gone up by about 2.69%, if I'm not mistaken, to 33.69%. So you have basically a situation where there is an adjustment of the stop limits on the Nigerian treasury bills markets, and the yield curve differential is closed. So the inflation to interest yield curve has to always close within a band. And that's why they keep adjusting these rates. So my fear is not like them raising money to finance the budget, which even if I have a concern with that, because you have basically like a fiscal strategy in the medium-term expenditure framework that relies 50% on debt, 50% on revenue. Our revenue expectation for Q1 of 2024 for the government has not been great.
Okay.
My concern is the rate at which they are borrowing these monies, considering that the government's owing nearly 100 trillion naira.
That's quite big. Well, we are going to talk more about the possible hike in interest rates by the MPC during the course of our discussion. But then we'll still dwell more on the issue of the Nigerian government having to go through whatever quotas from different areas to borrow money. Now, one question has come up. Why has Nigeria never sought debt relief under the G20 framework or individually?
Well, the issue about debt relief, which are basically like bilateral loans that have concessions with long moratoriums of 35 years, it's not an option right now. It's not an option because it's akin to going back to 2004, 2005, when former President Olusegun Obasanjo, with his Finance Minister Kondre Wela and the CBN governor then, Chukwuma Soludo, renegotiated the London and Paris Club debt that was actually paid by the FGN. And the Paris Club refund was because the monies were supposed to be paid back by the FG, not the FGN. The FGN consists of the federating units, federal, state, and local governments. So there was that refund. It shows the global community and investors that when you're asking for debt relief, you failed. And you're basically asking for a reset. Like Ghana, for example, had a technical default on $13.1 billion of euro bonds that is owing to creditors, and also money is owing in domestic markets. The domestic market has been renegotiated. There's been an exchange, but the international markets has not been renegotiated. And this is for the same reason why the government has refused to go to the IMF to seek for help, because the IMF will come out with a list of conditions and the optics will show that the government has failed and is looking for a bailout. So I don't think going for a bailout right now makes sense in terms of the fact that the government is trying to rebalance the economy, is trying to pay down ways and means, even if I'm not impressed by the fact that the balance sheet has increased by another 2 trillion naira within the last quarter. And basically, the Senate is delaying on passing the amendment of the CBN Act of 2007, especially for Sections 38. And the new proposal that was made by the Senate Committee on Banking, Insurance, and Financial Services says that the federal government cannot borrow money from the CBN for more than 3 months. And if it does, it has to pledge its share of FAC revenues as a collateral in an irrevocable standing payment order, which is what the banks have with most state governments currently that borrow money from them. They have their FAC accounts pledged as collateral for those loans. So I don't really think that it makes sense to go to G20 and use that framework to renegotiate for debt relief. We're not yet at that point, but I expect that the fiscal side will match up with the several reforms, very good reform that the CBN has been implementing since last year.
Okay. Well, we also understand that there's a $500 billion World Bank loan in the offing. And of course, the National Assembly seems to have ratified that. That is also going to add to the debt burden, of course, by the time Nigeria would have to pay back. But then let's keep that and look at Nigeria's oil production now. Now, according to reports, Nigeria's oil output is approaching 1.7 million barrels per day, according to Mele Kyari, who is the Group Chief Executive Officer of the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited. Now, Kyari highlighted the ongoing gas infrastructure project to transport 8 billion stockpiles per day within 4 years. So, Kelvin, is this announcement significant and sustainable, and could it impact Nigeria's foreign reserves in any way?
So, I heard the Group CEO of NNPCL say that the reason why Nigeria has the highest unit production cost per barrel in the world, which is anywhere between $48 and $60 per barrel, is because of insecurity and the contracting cycle. I think those excuses are excuses, and they should stay in the trash bin. I'm not impressed with NNPCL, because if NNPCL were doing the work that they were supposed to do, Nigeria will not be in the fiscal mess that it's currently in. It's a good development that they found a new marginal field that is producing, expected to do 40,000 barrels per day. But the reality is that even if you get to 1.7 million barrels, for example, how much of that is unencumbered? Look, Dangote Oil Refinery Company, DOC, has issued tenders to import 24 million barrels of crude oil or in Western Texas Intermediate from the US. Why will we in 2024, considering that it took 7 to 8 years to build the largest single train refinery in the world, why will Nigeria in 2024 be importing crude oil to produce? Some people have said the subsea pipe that is being built from the Niger Delta to Lagos to Lekki will. And I say, if you have the infrastructure and you don't have feedstock to pass through it, of course, you uses it. So, when you look at the issue of energy security, you look at the fact that Nigeria intermittently has petroleum scarcity, jet A1 prices are high, diesel prices are high, and that contributes to inflation. You want to look at the fact that in the midstream, there is no feedstock to supply the commercial refiner to refine into the different derivatives. 9 derivatives that are produced by refineries consumes 2.4 billion US dollars per month in Nigeria's energy basket. So, it's not about you getting to 1.7 million barrels. The question is, out of that 1.7, and if you look at the joint oil agreements and production sharing contracts, how much of this is unencumbered? How much of it are you not paying to draw down debts in for sale agreements to international oil traders who are like collectors for the multilateral development banks and international creditors that are being owed money? The last of which was the Afro-Exim $30.4 billion Project Gazelle loan, which has a lot of questions, by the way, and which I'm really, really disappointed that the Senate and the House of Rep has refused to probe, because that deal has a lot of issues that needs to be answered that are not clear and straightforward for Nigerians to know. Because you're staking 164 million barrels of crude oil, which is nearly 4 times the value of the loan you collected, in exchange for $30.4 billion. And you're borrowing $30.4 billion at about 11.85%, considering that the secured overnight financing rate for multilateral development bank loans is 6%. So you have an additional 5.85% country risk premium on Nigeria. So, announcements like this from NNPCL, like it's just a regular news cycle. It's for me, it doesn't move the needle, and I'm not impressed with what NNPCL is doing.
Well, that's quite interesting, Kelvin. Well, you have talked about refining capacity and infrastructural development along that corridor. But then, even as we continue to question the rationale behind this, we still need to also know from your end if you think that Nigeria can still attain or probably exceed 2 million barrels per day outputs. Now, if yes, I'd like to know what will be needed to achieve that. And if no, what do you think the limiting factors would be?
You listen to the chairman of Total, Puyan, at the Africa CEO Forum in Kigali, talk about why in the last 12 years we've not had any deep water or offshore investments in the oil and gas sector in Nigeria. You listen to him. I mean, the issues are very clear. There is no clarity on policy. The PIA is not being implemented. Companies don't know where they stand. Onshore, you have a lot of security issues, even if the federal government has 30 external contractors, security contractors that are supposed to guide pipes from flow station to terminal. There's still crude oil theft in hundreds of thousands of barrels of crude work, and security contract worth hundreds of billions of naira is not producing the required results that we're supposed to see. So for me, I don't want to comment on security matters, but because I'm not an expert in that area. But the fact that we've not been able to solve how to integrate installing pressure and temperature sensor meters on pipes, on crude oil pipes, and link that to the security agencies in terms of the intelligence agencies and the enforcement agencies and their response, and solve the issue of crude oil theft in the Niger Delta, and the fact that companies, especially the IOCs, are divesting away from their onshore and marginal fields, deep inland basin fields to offshore, and they're not really interested in investing in new rigs. It tells you all you need to know. Look, I think it's important for NNPCL to, if they're going to achieve going above 2 million barrels per day, go back to the fact that they are a private company and they need to stop getting control from the villa, number one. Number two, the president needs to restructure Ministry of Finance Incorporated, get the competent management, and transfer the beneficial ownership and administration of NNPCL to an asset manager, which is supposed to be Ministry of Finance Incorporated to manage. They will determine what needs to stay and what needs to go. For example, the refinery in Port Harcourt that was built by Shell and British Petroleum and was completed in 1989, 210,000 barrels per day, is moribund, is dead, is defunct. I think the government needs to scrap it and sell it off as scrap. I don't think it makes sense for you to keep that refinery because they can't even guarantee crude oil stock that will supply or feed that refinery. So NNPCL needs to go undergo business process reengineering, and for you to do that, you basically need to first of all embark on external forensic audits to determine the true state of NNPCL, and then look at the business lines upstream, midstream, and downstream. I don't think NNPCL should keep their downstream business. I think they should stay upstream and midstream and invest strategically in increasing oil production and also strategically in the midstream sector for refining and also for petrochemicals.
Okay. All right. Well, okay, let's move away from that, Kevin, and look at this last part of our discussion. It has to do with the CBN's NPC meeting, of course. The question is, should the interest rates hold at what it is right now, or should it be raised? Now, the Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank of Nigeria is expected to raise the benchmark rate to counter inflation, according to analyst projections. However, some financial commentators believe that the NPC will remain at the monetary policy rate, and the CBN Governor, Dr. Olayemi Cardoso, has stated that the committee will take necessary actions. Now, I'd like to find out, do you support a hike in interest rates or not? And I'd like you to just give reasons for your choices, because earlier on you talked about how interest rates was increased in March and how it has spiked inflation, and we are at the crossroad right now. What do you think should obtain?
Well, look, there's the issue of what the MPC needs to do, and there's the issue of do we really keep depending on the CBN alone to fight inflation? Now, the good news is that inflation is slowing down. you could see that it only went up marginally compared to the hike from March to April. It's my belief that inflation will peak in June, and by when we see the July reading, we'll either see like a plateau or a slight drop down. Now, I expect that the MPC this afternoon is going to raise the monetary policy rate by 150 basis points or 1.5%. That's what I expect will happen. The question now is if you raise it to 26.5% and they adjust the prime lending rate, and within 10 days, the banks are obligated to write their borrowers to inform them that they're increasing their rates, adjusting their rates. What happens to dependency on already existing borrowers? Considering that the non-performing loan ratio recommended by the CBN is between 4.8% and 5.6%, and that has gone up. The NPL ratio for banks, when you look at the weighted average, has gone up above 7%. And this is especially when you consider the fact that how do you calculate the capital adequacy ratio of banks, which is supposed to be 15% for tier 1, 10% for tier 2 banks, calculated by dividing the total deposits, total capital they have by their total risk-weighted assets. Now, in banking, if your total risk-weighted assets in terms of your non-performing loan book keeps rising up, it means that your LDR is rising up, your loan deposit ratio is rising up. And it also means that the quality of your assets are decreasing and your capital adequacy ratio is impaired. And you have to keep adding to your capital in order to reduce the risk and meet up with the regulatory requirement of 15% for tier 1 and 10% for tier 2. So there is a question of if you raise the rate, which is the right thing to do today, so that the exchange rate is going to drop marginally and you're going to see inflows of FPIs into the Nigerian treasury bills markets at anywhere between 23 and 25% for yields. You're going to have a relief or a reprieve in terms of the exchange rate. The exchange rate will probably drop to like 1,003 or 1,002 or 1,150. But the question now is, how is it going to affect the stability of the banking system, considering that the CBN has revised the minimum capital requirement for recapitalization of banks? So for me, my suggestion to the Monetary Policy Committee, for example, is I think it's time for them to for creative solutions and consider linking the loan deposit ratio for banks, which is currently at 50% across board, and make it not an across board LDR rates.
All right.
Like on rates. It's time for them to reward banks based on their LDR performance. For banks that have LDR above 50%, they can decide to reduce the cash reserve ratio so that the banks will have money to provide to businesses who need to lend, because the CBN basically is trying to sacrifice fighting inflation for growth in the economy.
Okay. Okay, finally, Kelvin, in about a minute or two, you've actually spoken extensively as to how whatever decision the CBN's MPC will be making would affect the banking industry. But what about the people now? Inflation rates is as high as 33.69%. Are there any quick fixes to the issue as regards inflation away from benchmark rate hikes? Of course, the cost of living crisis is also there. Are there anything that you think can be done to actually cushion these effects?
I'm aware that there's a presidential committee currently that was constituted by the president to look into emergency imports of food to, stem food inflation. While it's important to do that, to provide relief to Nigerians, it's also important to note that you need to protect industries in Nigeria, especially companies that have invested hundreds of billions of naira in backward integration programs across the food, primary and secondary layers of the food supply chain. Unfortunately, there are no quick fixes like magic wand, like stroke of a button fixes. But if the government looks at the fiscal side of the equation and amends the tax code, they send the NNPCL to a beneficial owner, go through the reforms I mentioned earlier, and raise revenue to GDP ratio, and they rely less on the central bank that increases money supply and causes cost push inflation. And the demand side pool, we're going to see reprieve with inflation, and we're going to see reprieve for Nigerians. I understand it's a very tough grind that people are going through. People are really going through the ringer. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful and positive because all we can do at this point is positive and hopeful that things are going to turn a corner and change for the better.
Well, we just need to keep the hope alive, just as you've said. Kelvin Emmanuel, economist and CEO, Dairy Hill. Thank you so much for being extensive with us on this particular segment of the show. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.